Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we are covering a packed news cycle that stretches from the muddy trails of California to the halls of power in Copenhagen, with stops in Hong Kong, Shanghai, and the cartel-controlled corridors leading to the 2026 World Cup.
I'm Maya Clarity, and let me tell you, when you start pulling at the threads connecting tonight's stories, a picture emerges. We're looking at massive capital flows in the electric vehicle industry, a government scrambling to respond to one of the deadliest fires in Hong Kong's modern history, security fears around the biggest sporting event on the planet, and a Danish election that has everything to do with American expansionism. Buckle up.
We're starting tonight with something that might sound like a simple car review, but trust me, it's not. Subaru just unveiled its answer to the electric vehicle revolution, and the question isn't just whether it can handle a mud pit. The question is whether a legacy automaker can survive what's coming next.
Then we'll move to NIO, the Chinese EV giant that just secured over 2 billion yuan in fresh investment. What does that money mean for the global EV race, and who's really bankrolling the future of transportation?
Plus, nearly 5 months after a fire killed 168 people in Hong Kong, displaced residents are finally being told they can retrieve their belongings. We're going to ask the hard questions about why it took this long, and what the investigation has revealed about building safety in one of the world's most densely populated cities. Let's get into it.
Our first story tonight takes us to Southern California, where Subaru invited journalists out on a rainy day to test drive what they're calling the Uncharted EV. According to reporting from Electrek, this is Subaru's big swing at the electric vehicle market, and they chose to debut it not on a highway or a showroom floor, but in the mud.
And that choice tells you everything about Subaru's strategy here. This is a company that has built its entire brand identity around all-wheel drive capability, around being the car for people who actually go off the beaten path. So when they enter the EV space, they can't just build another electric crossover that looks like everything else on the market. They have to prove that electrification doesn't mean sacrificing what made Subaru, Subaru.
The timing here is critical, Alex. Subaru has been widely criticized for being slow to the EV game. Their first electric offering, the Solterra, which was essentially a rebadged Toyota BZ4X, received lukewarm reviews and didn't exactly set the sales charts on fire. The Uncharted represents Subaru going it alone, building something from their own vision rather than borrowing from a partner.
What Electrek's first drive coverage reveals is that Subaru leaned heavily into the off-road angle during this press event. They set up a course with mud, with inclines, with the kind of terrain that would challenge a traditional SUV, let alone an electric vehicle. And reportedly, the Uncharted handled it. The symmetrical all-wheel drive system that Subaru is known for has been adapted for the electric powertrain, and the instant torque delivery that comes with electric motors actually gives it an advantage in low-traction situations.
But here's where we need to dig deeper, because the off-road spectacle, as impressive as it might be, is also a bit of a distraction from the harder questions. How does this vehicle stack up on range? On charging speed? On the software experience that consumers increasingly expect? Electrek raised exactly this point, asking how the Uncharted compares to the rest of the EV market today, and that's the real test.
Because the EV market in 2026 is not the EV market of 2022. You've got Chinese manufacturers like BYD producing compelling vehicles at price points that legacy automakers struggle to match. You've got Tesla still dominating the charging infrastructure conversation. You've got Hyundai and Kia delivering excellent electric vehicles with fast charging and competitive range. Subaru is entering a fight that has gotten significantly more crowded and more competitive.
And let's talk about what this means for Subaru's loyal customer base. These are outdoorsy buyers, many of them in the Pacific Northwest and mountain states. They need range for road trips. They need reliability in cold weather, which is where EV batteries historically struggle. They need the ability to charge in rural areas where charging infrastructure is still sparse. A mud course in Orange County is fun, but it doesn't answer whether this vehicle works for a ski trip to remote Montana.
The broader story here is about the survival of mid-size automakers in the electric transition. Subaru doesn't have the scale of Toyota or the venture capital runway of a startup like Rivian. They have to get this right without the margin for error that bigger players enjoy. The Uncharted isn't just a new model, it's an existential bet.
Exactly right. And we should note that the EV market globally is in a fascinating and somewhat brutal phase right now. Which brings us perfectly to our next story, because while Subaru is trying to carve out its niche, one of China's most prominent EV companies just secured a massive new round of investment.
NIO Incorporated announced today that its subsidiary, Genetec, which goes by the name Xinji, has entered into definitive agreements for an investment totaling 2.257 billion Chinese yuan. That's roughly $310 million at current exchange rates. This was reported through a company press release picked up by CleanTechnica.
Let's break down what's actually happening here, because the corporate structure matters. NIO isn't receiving this investment directly into its main car-building operation. It's going into Genetec, a subsidiary. And the investors are described as certain investors, which is the kind of deliberately vague language that should make any journalist sit up and pay attention.
NIO has positioned itself as more than just a car company. They've been building out battery swap technology, autonomous driving capabilities, and a premium brand experience aimed at competing with the likes of BMW and Mercedes in the Chinese market. But this strategy is expensive, phenomenally expensive, and NIO has been burning through cash at a rate that has made investors nervous for years.
The significance of this investment is multifold. First, it signals that despite the brutal competition in China's EV market, where dozens of startups have already gone bankrupt, there are still investors willing to put serious money behind NIO's vision. Second, the fact that it's flowing through a subsidiary suggests this may be tied to a specific technology or business line rather than general operations.
And we need to talk about the geopolitical dimension here. NIO is listed on the New York Stock Exchange, the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, and the Singapore Exchange. That triple listing is a deliberate strategy to maintain access to Western capital markets while also deepening ties in Asia. In an era of increasing US-China tensions over technology and trade, the way Chinese EV companies fund themselves is not just a business story, it's a geopolitical story.
The Chinese government has been a significant supporter of its domestic EV industry through subsidies, infrastructure investment, and favorable regulatory frameworks. When we see a company like NIO securing billions in new investment, we should ask how much of that ecosystem is propped up by state support, and what that means for competitors in other countries who don't receive the same level of backing.
This is exactly the argument that European and American automakers have been making as they push for tariffs on Chinese EVs. The European Union has already imposed additional tariffs. The United States under the current administration has maintained steep tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. The argument is that companies like NIO benefit from an uneven playing field, and that investment like what we're seeing today is partially enabled by that structural advantage.
But let's be fair in our analysis. NIO has also genuinely innovated in areas like battery swap technology, where you can pull into a station and have your depleted battery physically swapped for a fully charged one in minutes. That's a real solution to range anxiety and charging time that no Western automaker has replicated at scale. Investment flowing into that kind of innovation, regardless of where it comes from, pushes the entire industry forward.
The bottom line is this: the global EV race is not just about who builds the best car. It's about who has the deepest pockets, the most favorable government support, and the most resilient supply chain. Today's NIO investment is another data point in a competition that will reshape the global auto industry for decades to come.
Now we need to shift gears to a story that is heartbreaking and infuriating in equal measure. We're going to Hong Kong, where residents of Wang Fuk Court in Taipa have been told they can finally return to their flats to retrieve personal belongings by late April. This comes nearly 5 months after a fire that killed 168 people.
Let that number sit with you for a moment. 168 people dead. According to the South China Morning Post, this was the deadliest fire in Hong Kong in decades. Nearly 5,000 residents were displaced from the Wang Fuk Court estate. And now, 5 months later, authorities are telling people they might be able to go back and get whatever survived the flames.
The South China Morning Post reports that more than 630 displaced homeowners submitted a petition to the government, describing their request as a humble and urgent wish to retrieve cherished possessions. Think about what that means. These are people who lost neighbors, who lost family members, who fled with nothing, and they've had to beg to be allowed back to see what's left of their homes.
The timeline here demands scrutiny. The fire occurred in late 2025. We are now at the end of February 2026, and authorities are saying late April for retrieval. That is roughly 6 months from the disaster to the point where people can simply walk into their own homes and collect their belongings. Now, there are legitimate structural safety concerns. The building was severely damaged. But 6 months raises real questions about bureaucratic efficiency and whether displaced residents have been treated as a priority.
And we have to ask the harder questions about how this fire happened in the first place. Wang Fuk Court is a public housing estate. Hong Kong has one of the most extensive public housing systems in the world, housing roughly a third of the population. These estates are densely packed. Fire safety in such environments is not a luxury, it is an absolute necessity, and somewhere, those safety systems failed catastrophically.
The investigation into the cause of the fire is ongoing, but regardless of what it ultimately reveals, the death toll of 168 people in a modern, wealthy city like Hong Kong points to systemic failures. Whether it was inadequate fire suppression systems, blocked evacuation routes, building materials that didn't meet safety standards, or delayed emergency response, something went profoundly wrong.
What makes this even more painful is that Hong Kong's public housing residents are often among the city's most vulnerable. These are families who waited years, sometimes over a decade, on waiting lists to get into public housing. They don't have the financial cushion to absorb a disaster like this. They can't just rent a new apartment while they wait for access to their belongings. Many of these families are in genuine crisis.
The government has provided temporary housing and some financial assistance, but advocacy groups have argued it's not enough. The petition from those 630 homeowners speaks volumes. When residents of a public housing estate have to organize a formal petition just to retrieve their own belongings from their own homes, it tells you something about the power dynamic between the government and the people it's supposed to serve.
We'll be following this story closely, because the real test isn't just when people get their belongings back. It's what changes in fire safety regulations, in building inspections, in emergency response protocols. 168 lives demand nothing less than a complete overhaul.
Now let's pivot to a story that sits at the volatile intersection of organized crime, global sports, and national security. The 2026 FIFA World Cup is coming, and Al Jazeera's investigative series, Game Theory, has dropped a new segment titled Cartels, Chaos, and the 2026 World Cup.
For those who haven't been tracking this, the 2026 World Cup is being co-hosted by the United States, Mexico, and Canada. It's the first time 3 countries have jointly hosted the tournament, and it's going to be the largest World Cup in history, expanded to 48 teams from the previous 32. Matches will be played across 16 cities in all 3 countries.
And it's the Mexico component that Al Jazeera is zeroing in on. Mexico is hosting matches in Guadalajara, Monterrey, and Mexico City. Guadalajara and Monterrey are in states where drug cartels have significant operational presence. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world, is headquartered in Jalisco, the state where Guadalajara sits.
This is not hypothetical fearmongering. Cartel violence in Mexico has been escalating, and the cartels have a documented history of involving themselves in major economic events. They extort businesses, they control territory, they influence local governance. The question Al Jazeera is raising is what happens when you drop hundreds of thousands of international tourists into cities where these organizations operate.
The security implications are staggering. FIFA and the host nations have made assurances about safety, but let's be honest about the scale of the challenge. You're talking about securing stadiums, fan zones, transit corridors, hotels, and entertainment districts across multiple cities, some of which have active cartel operations in their surrounding areas. This isn't like securing a single stadium for a Champions League final. This is a months-long, multi-city, multi-country security operation.
And there's a financial dimension that doesn't get enough attention. Cartels are sophisticated business operations. A massive influx of tourists means a massive influx of cash, and cartels have historically found ways to profit from exactly this kind of economic activity, whether through drug sales to tourists, extortion of local businesses catering to visitors, or money laundering through legitimate-seeming commercial operations set up around the event.
What makes Al Jazeera's reporting valuable is that they're asking these questions now, months before the tournament begins. This is the time when security plans are being finalized, when infrastructure is being built, when diplomatic agreements between the 3 host nations are being cemented. If the cartel dimension is not being taken seriously at the planning level, it will be too late to address when the matches start.
We should also note the political complexity. The Mexican government under President Claudia Sheinbaum has continued many of the policies of her predecessor regarding cartel management, and the results have been mixed at best. Meanwhile, the United States has its own fraught relationship with Mexico on issues of border security and drug trafficking. Hosting a joint World Cup requires a level of security cooperation that is challenging even between allied nations, let alone nations with this much political tension.
The bottom line is that the 2026 World Cup should be a celebration of global sport, but the decision to host matches in cartel-influenced regions carries real risks that demand transparent public discussion, not just behind closed-door security briefings. Al Jazeera is right to push this conversation into the open.
Our final story tonight takes us to Denmark, where Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen has called a snap parliamentary election for March 24th. And this one, Alex, is directly connected to one of the most extraordinary geopolitical provocations of the past year.
According to Al Jazeera, Frederiksen is calling this election to capitalize on rising support for her stance against U.S. efforts to acquire Greenland. Let me say that again for anyone who might have tuned in late. The Prime Minister of Denmark is calling an election because the United States government has been actively attempting to take control of Greenland, a Danish autonomous territory, and her resistance to that effort is making her popular.
This is a story that would have sounded like satire just a few years ago, but here we are. The Trump administration has made the acquisition of Greenland an explicit policy goal, framing it as a matter of national security and strategic interest in the Arctic. Greenland sits atop vast mineral resources, including rare earth elements critical to modern technology, and its geographic position is strategically significant for both military operations and Arctic shipping routes.
Denmark, a NATO ally of the United States, has found itself in the extraordinary position of having to defend its territorial sovereignty against its most powerful ally. Frederiksen has been unequivocal in rejecting any sale or transfer of Greenland, and it appears that this stance has become a rallying point for Danish voters across the political spectrum.
The timing of this election is tactically brilliant. By calling the vote now, Frederiksen is essentially turning the election into a referendum on Danish sovereignty. Any opposition party that wants to challenge her has to either match her stance on Greenland or risk being seen as soft on national sovereignty. It's a nearly unbeatable political position.
But let's zoom out and look at what this represents on the global stage. A small European democracy is being pressured by the world's most powerful nation to surrender territory, and the democratic response is to hold an election and let the people speak. That's a powerful statement about the resilience of democratic institutions, even when they're under pressure from allies.
There's also the Greenlandic perspective that often gets lost in the Denmark versus America framing. Greenland has its own government and has been on a path toward greater autonomy and potentially full independence for years. Many Greenlanders resent both the American overtures and Danish paternalism. They want self-determination on their own terms, not to be a pawn in a great power chess match.
The rare earth mineral angle cannot be overstated. As the world transitions to electric vehicles, renewable energy, and advanced electronics, the demand for rare earth minerals is skyrocketing. China currently dominates the global rare earth supply chain, and Greenland's deposits represent one of the few alternatives. Control of Greenland isn't just about Arctic military bases. It's about controlling a piece of the supply chain that underpins the entire modern economy.
And notice how this connects back to our earlier stories. We talked about Subaru trying to build electric vehicles, about NIO securing billions in investment for EV technology. The batteries, the motors, the electronics in those vehicles all require rare earth minerals. Greenland is sitting on some of the largest untapped deposits of those very minerals. The fight over Greenland is, in part, a fight over who controls the future of transportation.
Frederiksen's gamble is that Danish voters will reward her for standing firm. The polls suggest she's right. But the larger question is what happens after the election. The US pressure on Greenland isn't going to stop because Denmark holds a vote. This is going to be a prolonged geopolitical contest, and small nations defending their sovereignty against great power pressure is one of the defining stories of our era.
So let's bring it all together, Alex, because tonight's stories, as diverse as they seem, paint a coherent picture of the world in February 2026.
The connective tissue is the global competition for resources and influence that's reshaping every aspect of our world. Start with the auto industry. Subaru is trying to survive an electric transition that demands massive capital investment and access to battery materials. NIO is securing billions in funding in a race that's as much geopolitical as it is commercial. Both companies, and every automaker on the planet, are dependent on supply chains that trace back to mines in places like Greenland, the Congo, and China.
Then look at the governance dimension. In Hong Kong, 168 people died in a public housing fire, and the government's response has been slow enough that residents had to petition just to retrieve their own belongings. That's what happens when systems prioritize economic development over human safety, when building codes are lax or unenforced, when the voices of ordinary people are treated as an afterthought.
In Mexico, the government is trying to host a World Cup while cartels operate with near impunity in the host cities. That's a failure of governance that has been decades in the making, fueled by drug demand from the United States and enabled by corruption at every level. And in Denmark, a functioning democracy is responding to external pressure the way democracies should, by asking the people what they want.
The pattern across all of these stories is the tension between concentrated power and the people who have to live with its consequences. Automakers and their investors concentrate capital and make decisions that determine whether working families can afford transportation. Governments make building safety decisions that determine whether families live or die. Criminal organizations concentrate violent power in ways that threaten the safety of millions. And great powers try to concentrate territorial control in ways that override the sovereignty of smaller nations.
What journalism is supposed to do, what this show tries to do every night, is make those power dynamics visible. When NIO secures billions in investment, who ultimately benefits? When Subaru bets its future on an EV platform, what workers and communities are affected? When a fire kills 168 people, who failed in their duty to prevent it? When cartels threaten World Cup security, who is responsible for the conditions that allowed cartels to thrive?
And when the United States tries to take Greenland, what does it tell us about the rules-based international order that America itself helped create? These aren't abstract questions. They affect real people making real decisions about their lives, their safety, and their futures.
That's what we do here at Truth Report. We follow the money, we follow the power, and we tell you what we find. Tonight, what we found is a world in the grip of a resource competition that's rewriting the rules of industry, governance, and sovereignty all at once.
The question for all of us is whether the systems we've built, democratic institutions, regulatory frameworks, international law, are strong enough to ensure that this competition serves people rather than just the powerful. Tonight's stories suggest the answer is very much in doubt.
Before we go, we want to hear from you. The Wang Fuk Court fire story in particular deserves more attention. 168 people dead in a modern city should be front-page news everywhere, and it's not getting the coverage it deserves. Share this story. Demand accountability. That's how journalism translates into change.
And keep your eyes on Denmark. The March 24th election is going to be one of the most consequential votes in European politics this year, not because of domestic policy, but because it will send a signal about whether small democracies can still say no to great powers. That matters for every country on Earth.
For Truth Report, I'm Alex Truth. Thank you for watching, thank you for thinking critically, and thank you for demanding better from the institutions that shape your world.
I'm Maya Clarity. Stay informed, stay skeptical, and we'll see you next time.